Have you ever heard of a society so obsessed with purity that it was willing to bury its own daughters alive? In ancient Rome, there were girls, sometimes as young as 6, who were chosen to dedicate their entire lives to a single flame. A flame that could never go out. To the Romans, this was no ordinary fire. It was the eternal flame of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, the home, and the very soul of the empire. As long as the flame burned, Rome would endure. But if it ever went out, it was seen as a sign of disaster, a warning that the gods themselves were turning their backs on the city. The guardians of this sacred fire were known as the Vestal Virgins. To many, they were living symbols of Rome's purity and moral strength. They were honored in public, given privileges that few women, or even men, could ever dream of. But behind the white robes and sacred rituals lay a much darker reality. They were prisoners of their vow, bound by chains far stronger than iron. 30 years of service, 30 years of chastity, 30 years of living as property of the state. Tonight, we're going to uncover their story. A story of power, faith, fear, and brutal punishment. This is the hidden truth of Rome's Vestal Virgins. To understand the Vestal Virgins, we have to travel back nearly 3,000 years, to the earliest days of Rome, long before it was an empire, when it was still just a struggling city-state trying to carve out its place in the world. The Romans were deeply religious people. They believed that every event, whether a good harvest, a military victory, or even a thunderstorm, was a direct reflection of the gods' favor or anger. To them, the survival of the city depended not only on armies and politics, but on the rituals that kept the gods satisfied. Among all the gods and goddesses in Rome, one stood at the very heart of daily life. Vesta, the goddess of the hearth, the home, and the sacred flame. Unlike other deities, she wasn't represented by grand statues or dramatic myths. Her presence was simple, yet vital. Every Roman household had a small fire at its center, and keeping it alive symbolized family unity and protection. On a larger scale, the city itself also had a fire, Rome's eternal flame, burning in her temple in the Forum. As long as it burned, it was believed that Rome would endure. So who would guard this fire? Who could be trusted with a task so important that the very fate of the empire seemed to depend on it? According to ancient tradition, it was Rome's second king, Numa Pompilius, who established the order of the Vestal Virgins in the 7th century BCE. He recognized that this sacred flame could not be left to chance. It needed guardians, chosen carefully, bound by oath, and dedicated completely to the service of Vesta. But why young girls? Why demand such sacrifices from children who barely understood what their lives would become? The answer lies in Roman values. Purity was not just a religious idea, it was a political one. The flame represented Rome's survival, and only those who embodied absolute innocence and chastity could be entrusted with it. To the Romans, children were uncorrupted by desire, and girls, in particular, could serve as symbols of untouched purity. Once chosen, these girls were removed from their families and given to the state. From that moment on, their identity was transformed. They were no longer daughters of Rome's citizens. They were daughters of Vesta herself. The process of selection was solemn and frightening. Candidates had to meet strict criteria. They had to be between 6 and 10 years old, have both parents alive, and be free from any physical blemish or moral stain. Their families had to be respected Roman citizens, and the child had to be born from a lawful marriage. This was more than a religious test. It was a reflection of Rome's obsession with order, purity, and legitimacy. The final choice rested in the hands of the Pontifex Maximus, Rome's chief priest. Sometimes he drew lots, sometimes he pointed directly to a girl in the crowd. Imagine the tension in those moments. Families holding their breath, praying not to be chosen, while others forced smiles of false pride. For many parents, it was not an honor, but a heartbreak. They knew their daughter was being taken away forever. Once chosen, the girl was led through the streets in silence. She crossed the sacred road, leaving behind her childhood forever. From that moment, she belonged to the state. She was both honored and imprisoned. The origins of the Vestal Virgins reveal something essential about Rome itself. The institution wasn't just about religion, it was about control. By binding young girls to a life of chastity and duty, Rome created living symbols of its own purity, a constant reminder that the survival of the city rested on obedience, discipline, and sacrifice. And yet, behind this noble facade, one can already sense the darker truth. The girls chosen as Vestals were not volunteers. They were sacrifices, given not to the gods, but to the machinery of the state. Imagine a bright Roman morning in the Forum. The streets are alive with the sounds of merchants, priests, and citizens. Yet in one corner, a crowd has gathered in uneasy silence. Today, the Pontifex Maximus, the chief priest of Rome, will choose a new Vestal Virgin. In the crowd stand several young girls, all between 6 and 10 years old. They are dressed in plain clothes, their hair neatly tied, their parents standing nervously behind them. Each girl knows that her life may change forever within the next few moments. For some, their families whisper prayers that their daughter will be overlooked. For others, there is pride mixed with dread, an honor that feels more like a sentence. The requirements are strict. The girl must come from a respectable family, both parents alive, her body unblemished, and her lineage free of scandal. She must be pure not just in body, but in name, for she will represent the purity of Rome itself. The Pontifex Maximus steps forward. Sometimes he draws lots, reaching into a vessel to select the name of the chosen child. Other times, he simply points, one gesture of his hand sealing a fate. Imagine that moment, the sudden weight of silence as the priest's finger extends, the chosen girl's heart pounding, her mother stifling a cry, her father's eyes fixed on the ground. Once chosen, the ceremony moves swiftly. The girl is separated from her family, taken by the priests, and led away in solemn silence. She crosses the Sacra Via, the sacred road, but not as an ordinary Roman child. From this day forward, she belongs to the goddess Vesta. She is no longer a daughter, no longer a child of her household. She is property of the state, a symbol of Rome's eternal flame. For the family, this moment is deeply ambivalent. Outwardly, they are expected to show pride, for their daughter has been elevated to the highest honor a Roman girl could receive. Yet many accounts suggest that tears and grief were more common than celebration. To lose a daughter to Vesta was to lose her forever. She could not marry, could not return home, could not even bear the name she once carried. The selection ritual was not simply about choosing a girl, it was about transforming her identity. In a single moment, she was stripped of her childhood, her family ties, and her future, and remade into a sacred figure whose every breath now belonged to Rome. The people watched in reverence, but for the chosen girl, the path ahead was clear: 30 years of service, chastity, and obedience, with no escape and no turning back. Once the girl was chosen, her childhood ended at the temple doors. She was taken into the Atrium Vesti, the house of the Vestals, an elegant but enclosed residence in the very heart of the Roman Forum. To outsiders, it seemed a place of honor, with marble courtyards, statues, and sacred halls. But to the girls who lived there, it was both home and prison. Their service lasted 30 years, divided into 3 stages. The first 10 were for training. In these years, the young Vestals learned the sacred rites, the chants, the rituals of sacrifice, and the secrets of keeping the eternal flame alive. Older Vestals served as their teachers, instructing them not only in religion but also in discipline, silence, and obedience. Every movement, every word, every gesture was regulated by tradition. The next 10 years were the heart of their duty. By now, they were full-fledged Vestals, entrusted with guarding the sacred fire of Vesta. Day and night, in shifts, they watched over the flame that symbolized Rome's survival. To let it go out was unthinkable, a sign that the gods had abandoned the city. Alongside this central task, they participated in state ceremonies, tended the sacred objects of the goddess, and acted as living symbols of purity before the Roman people. The final 10 years were spent as mentors, teaching the younger novices, passing on the rituals, and preparing the next generation of guardians. Only after completing the full 30 years could a Vestal retire. Some chose to marry afterward, but most never did. Decades of isolation and sacred duty made it nearly impossible to return to ordinary life. Inside the atrium, their days followed a rigid rhythm: prayers, rituals, the tending of the flame, and silence. The house itself was large, with gardens, fountains, and private chambers, but it was still a gilded cage. The Vestals could not leave freely, could not mingle with society, and could not form bonds outside their order. Even conversation with men was tightly restricted, watched closely by priests and by Rome's ever-judging eyes. To the public, they were honored. They sat in the best seats at games, were greeted with reverence in the streets, and enjoyed privileges that ordinary women could never dream of. Yet this honor came at the cost of their freedom. Their bodies, their choices, even their futures belonged to the state. Life inside the house of the Vestals was a paradox, outwardly adorned with respect and privilege, but inwardly shaped by silence, discipline, and isolation. They were not chained by iron, but by vows that were far stronger, and far more difficult to break. For all their restrictions, the Vestal Virgins were far from powerless. In fact, they were some of the most privileged women in all of Rome, living symbols of the empire's moral strength, and treated with a respect that few even among the elite could command. In the streets, Vestals walked with an aura of sanctity. When they appeared in public, people moved aside. Their white robes and distinctive hairstyles marked them instantly, and Romans bowed their heads as the guardians of the flame passed by. They had their own seats of honor in theaters, games, and gladiatorial arenas, sitting alongside senators and magistrates, positions normally denied to women. Perhaps most extraordinary of all was their legal power. Unlike most Roman women, Vestals were free from the guardianship of fathers or husbands. They could own property, make wills, and manage their own wealth. They were among the only women in Rome with such independence. Even more dramatically, if a condemned prisoner happened to meet a Vestal on the way to execution, she could grant him pardon with nothing more than a touch. In that moment, her word outweighed the judgment of Rome's courts. These privileges gave the Vestals a unique position in Roman society. They were both untouchable and indispensable, elevated above ordinary citizens. In the eyes of the people, they were pure, sacred, and closer to the divine than anyone else. And yet, beneath this gilded image lay a bitter truth. Their privileges did not come from freedom, but from sacrifice. They could own property, but they could not own their own lives. They could pardon the condemned, but they themselves could never escape their vow. They were honored at festivals, but never allowed to join in love or family. The Vestals lived at the intersection of power and imprisonment. Rome exalted them as symbols of its greatness, while quietly keeping them bound to a destiny they had never chosen. For all their prestige, the Vestal Virgins lived under a shadow that never left them, the threat of punishment. Rome revered them as sacred, but that same sacredness made their failures catastrophic. The law that bound them was absolute, and when they broke it, or were even accused of breaking it, the punishments were merciless. The Vestals were bound to 3 laws above all others: to remain virgins, to obey without question, and to guard the eternal flame. Violating any of these vows was not simply a personal mistake. It was considered a direct offense against the gods, a dangerous omen that threatened the survival of the city itself. The most common transgression was allowing the flame to die. To us, that may sound like a simple accident, but to the Romans it was a disaster, a sign that Rome's contract with the gods had been broken. The punishment was swift. The Vestal responsible was scourged, whipped by the Pontifex Maximus himself. But even this brutal ritual was cloaked in a strange form of respect. The beating took place in darkness, so that the sacred body of the Vestal would not be exposed to public shame. She suffered, but unseen, as if the city wanted to hide its own cruelty behind a veil of ritual. Yet far worse was the breaking of the vow of chastity. To the Romans, this was incestum, a sacred violation, the pollution of Vesta's purity. The punishment was unlike anything else in Rome, because no Roman could spill the blood of a Vestal. Her body was too sacred to be executed in the usual way. Instead, Rome devised a punishment that was both silent and horrifying. She would be buried alive. The ritual was chilling in its calmness. The condemned Vestal was dressed in white, veiled like a bride. She was led through the forum in a silent procession, not unlike a funeral march. Citizens watched, but no one dared to intervene. The destination was the Campus Celeratus, the field of the wicked, just outside the city walls. There, an underground chamber had been prepared, a small room with a bed, a lamp, bread, water, and milk. Enough to pretend she was not being executed, merely imprisoned. Once the Vestal descended the steps, the entrance was sealed with earth and stones. The city declared that it was not killing her, but leaving her to the gods. In reality, there was no escape. She would breathe her last alone in the darkness, her name and memory erased from public life. Silence was part of the punishment. No cries, no spectacle, only the quiet burial of a life once held sacred. Ancient historians record several such tragedies. In 216 BCE, during the crisis of Rome's wars with Carthage, two Vestals named Opimia and Floronia were accused of breaking their vows. One took her own life, the other was buried alive. For the people of Rome, these executions were not simply punishments but rituals of purification. By sacrificing the Vestals, the city believed it was cleansing itself of impurity and restoring divine favor. But what makes these punishments even more terrifying is the lack of defense. A Vestal accused of misconduct had almost no chance to prove her innocence. Her trial was private, decided by the College of Pontiffs, and her fate rested entirely in the judgment of priests and politicians. In many cases, the mere suspicion of impropriety was enough to condemn her. The story of these punishments shows the stark reality of life as a Vestal Virgin. Honored in public, but in private, one mistake, one rumor, could destroy everything. Their lives were both exalted and expendable, treasured symbols of Rome's purity but also sacrifices waiting to be made. To serve as a Vestal was to live constantly between reverence and fear, surrounded by marble and ritual, yet haunted always by the silent tomb beneath the earth. To understand the Vestal Virgins fully, we must step away from the rituals and punishments and ask, what was it like to live as one of them? On the surface, they lived in luxury. The Atrium Vesti was a grand residence, decorated with statues and gardens. They were treated with respect, honored in ceremonies, and given privileges beyond the reach of ordinary Roman women. To the public, they were holy, untouchable, and powerful. But from the inside, their existence could feel like life inside a gilded cage. From the moment they were chosen, sometimes at only 6 years old, they were cut off from their families. They could no longer see themselves as daughters or sisters. They belonged to the state. Every friendship, every interaction, was monitored. Even speaking freely with a man could arouse suspicion. This constant surveillance created a deep sense of isolation. The Vestals lived together, but not in freedom. They were companions and fellow captives, bound by the same vow. The weight of chastity was not simply religious, it was political. Their bodies were symbols of Rome's virtue. Their lives were reminders that the survival of the empire depended on purity that was absolute, unbreakable, and lifelong. Imagine the psychological toll of living under such pressure. Knowing that if the sacred flame went out, the blame might fall on you. Knowing that a whisper, a rumor, could bring an investigation. Knowing that if accused, you would stand before priests who presumed guilt rather than innocence. To live as a Vestal was to live in a state of permanent tension. Revered in public, but always scrutinized in private. Honored with privileges, but trapped in obligations. Society, too, was shaped by this paradox. Romans exalted the Vestals as symbols of their greatness, yet feared them as potential sources of disaster. When a Vestal was accused of breaking her vow, the entire city interpreted it as a sign of decline, a warning that Rome's moral fabric was unraveling. In this way, the women became scapegoats for the anxieties of an empire. And perhaps that is the deepest tragedy of all. The Vestals were never just individuals. They were symbols, their humanity stripped away and replaced by ritual meaning. They lived not as themselves, but as reflections of Rome's hopes and fears. The sacred flame they guarded burned brightly in the Forum. But for the women who kept it alive, the cost was a life of silence, surveillance, and sacrifice. The Vestal Virgins were more than guardians of a sacred fire, they were instruments of Rome's political power. Their purity was not only a religious symbol but also a political statement, one that tied the destiny of the empire to the bodies of these women. In Roman thought, the chastity of the Vestals mirrored the moral integrity of the state itself. A pure Vestal meant a pure Rome. If she faltered, it was not seen as a personal failing but as evidence that Rome was corrupt or endangered. Politicians understood this, and at times, accusations against Vestals became tools of propaganda. By condemning them, leaders could present themselves as defenders of morality, purging the state of impurity and restoring divine favor. The power of the Vestals also reached into the courtroom. Their testimony carried unique weight, and their sacred authority could sway legal cases. Their ability to pardon condemned prisoners was not just a religious gesture but a demonstration of mercy that reinforced the image of Rome as a just and virtuous state. Even their presence in public life had political meaning. Seated in places of honor at games and ceremonies, they reminded citizens of Rome's eternal values. They were living advertisements for the state's stability, discipline, and divine protection. Yet this power was never truly theirs. It belonged to the empire, wielded through their image. They were symbols first, individuals second. Every aspect of their existence, from the privileges they enjoyed to the punishments they suffered, was carefully crafted to serve Rome's political narrative. In the end, the Vestal Virgins reveal how deeply religion and politics were intertwined in Roman society. The state used faith not simply to worship the gods, but to control people, project authority, and reinforce its claim to eternal greatness. For nearly 1,000 years, the Vestal Virgins had stood at the heart of Rome's spiritual and political life. As long as the flame of Vesta burned, Romans believed their empire would endure. But no institution, however sacred, could survive the sweeping changes that transformed Rome in the late 4th century. By this time, the empire was no longer the Rome of the Republic or the Caesars. Christianity was rising rapidly, spreading from a persecuted sect to the dominant religion of the empire. Emperors themselves began to convert, and the old gods of Rome, Jupiter, Mars, and even Vesta, were pushed aside. For the Christians, the eternal flame was no longer a symbol of protection but a remnant of pagan superstition. The rituals of the Vestals, once revered as the foundation of Rome's strength, now looked like relics of a dying world. In 394 CE, Emperor Theodosius I issued a decree that would change history forever. The Order of the Vestal Virgins was disbanded, and the sacred fire was extinguished. After centuries of uninterrupted burning, the flame that had symbolized Rome's eternity was allowed to die. For many, it was a sign that a new era had begun. The last Vestals, women who had devoted their lives to vows made in childhood, suddenly found themselves without purpose. Some faded into obscurity, others perhaps tried to return to a society that no longer had a place for them. The silence of history tells us little about their fates. With their end, Rome closed one of the most unique chapters in its history. The Vestal Virgins, once both feared and worshipped, vanished into legend. Their story reminds us how even the most sacred traditions can be swept away when the world changes. The eternal flame had burned for centuries, but even it could not outlast the empire that created it. For nearly a millennium, the Vestal Virgins stood as symbols of Rome's purity, discipline, and divine favor. They were chosen as children, raised in isolation, honored in public, and feared in silence. Their lives embodied the paradox of Rome itself: greatness built on sacrifice, virtue enforced by brutality. Inside the house of the Vestals, they lived with privileges no other women could claim: freedom from male guardianship, wealth, influence, and respect. Yet those privileges came at the cost of their freedom, their families, and often their very lives. They were praised as sacred, but punished without mercy. A single mistake, or even the rumor of one, could condemn them to a slow death beneath the earth. The rise of Christianity eventually extinguished their flame, both literally and symbolically. In 394 CE, when Theodosius ordered the disbanding of the Vestals, the eternal fire was allowed to die. Rome's oldest tradition faded into silence, leaving behind a legacy of reverence, fear, and tragedy. And so we are left with a question: what does a society lose when it demands purity at the cost of humanity? The Vestal Virgins remind us that behind every symbol of power, there are human lives, sacrificed, silenced, and forgotten. If you found this story as haunting as I did, let me know your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more journeys into the hidden corners of history.